Phyrexia Prime was supposed to be unconquerable, because it was protected by defense systems that could destroy entire fleets, and no enemy had ever reached the planet's surface in 300 years of Phyrexian expansion and conquest. But Jacob Hayes was not planning to bring a fleet, and he was going alone because one person who knew all the secrets was harder to detect than an army. He had studied the data crystals until he knew every defense grid and every patrol pattern and every security protocol around Phyrexia Prime, better than most Phyrexian commanders knew them, and the aliens had become so confident in their power that they never imagined someone would use their own information against them at the heart of their empire. His stolen stealth ship drifted through the outer defenses disguised as a supply transport, and he used access codes that Helen had extracted from the data crystals and updated based on Phyrexian communication patterns they had intercepted, and he passed 3 security checkpoints, and each time he transmitted the right codes at exactly the right moment. Maya's voice came through the encrypted channel with a delay because of the vast distance between Phyrexia Prime and Earth, and she told him he was inside the defense perimeter now, and if he got caught, there would be no rescue and no backup, and he would face the entire Imperial military alone. Jacob guided his ship through the atmosphere toward the surface and said he had been alone before, and it had worked out fine. And besides, being alone meant the Phyrexians only had one target to look for instead of many, and one person could hide easier than a group. The planet below was beautiful in a terrible way, because massive cities made of crystal towers rose from red oceans, and everything was designed to make people feel small and afraid, and it was all built from wealth, stolen from 1,000 conquered worlds, including Earth. At the center of the largest city stood the Imperial Citadel where the High Command ruled the Empire. But Jacob was not going there because he knew he could not fight through thousands of guards, and that was not his plan anyway, because he had learned that sometimes the best way to kill a snake was not to attack its head but to cut off its ability to communicate with its body. His target was the Central Communications Nexus, which was the facility that coordinated all Phyrexian military operations across the galaxy, and if he could seize control of it even for a few minutes, he could use the Empire-owned infrastructure against them and cause chaos on a scale the Phyrexians had never experienced. It took him 2 days to reach the facility, moving through the city with patience and careful planning, and he studied guard rotations and memorized patrol patterns and identified every security system he would need to bypass, and he looked like just another alien servant because he had changed his appearance using Phyrexian biotechnology. On the 3rd day, when the 3rd Imperial Fleet was preparing to leave for Earth, Jacob made his move during a shift change, and he used forged credentials and Helen hacking tools to get past security, and the Phyrexian guards were looking for armies and fleets, and they never imagined one person would dare to infiltrate their communications center. He reached the central control room and sealed it from the inside, and suddenly he was alone with the most powerful communications array in the galaxy, and he had maybe 15 minutes before they broke through the doors, so he had to work fast. Jacob transmitted his message across the entire Empire network, telling all resistance forces that the 3rd Imperial Fleet was leaving Phyrexia Prime undefended to attack Earth, and this was their moment to strike, and every conquered world should rise up now and attack the Phyrexian forces while they were scattered and confused. Then he did something even more dangerous, and he hacked into the Phyrexian military coordination system and began issuing false orders that looked like they came from the High Command, and he redirected fleets to defend worlds that were not under attack and recalled invasion forces to protect empty space and created chaos in the Empire logistics that would take weeks to untangle. The Phyrexians had built their empire on perfect coordination and overwhelming force, but Jacob turned their greatest strength into a weakness by using their own communication systems to spread confusion and disorder, and suddenly, commanders across the galaxy did not know which orders were real and which were fake. Alarms screamed throughout the facility, and Phyrexian security forces converged on his position. But Jacob had planned for this, and he knew exactly how long he could hold them off, and the answer was 11 minutes, which was exactly how long he needed to finish his work. As the Phyrexians breached the outer doors, Jacob sent one final message directly to the High Command private channel, and he told them they had conquered 1,000 worlds by making everyone afraid. But they forgot that fear works both ways, and he was one human standing at the heart of their empire, and they could not stop him, and how many more humans like him existed, and how many other species were realizing right now that the Phyrexians were not invincible. He set off the explosives he had planted throughout the communications nexus, and the blast destroyed the facility and cut off the high command ability to coordinate their military forces spread across the galaxy, and without communications, the Empire could not function. In the chaos that followed, resistance forces everywhere struck simultaneously, and the coordinated rebellion Jacob had started months ago on Earth erupted into full-scale warfare, and the Vrexian Empire suddenly could not talk to its own armies and began to collapse like a building with no foundation. On Earth, Maya watched the Third Imperial Fleet break formation and start arguing among themselves because their commanders could not receive orders from home, and she immediately launched an all-out assault with every force humanity had left, and the battle raged for 3 days, but without coordination, the Vrexians fought desperately and without strategy. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out, and on Aqualis, the Sithari reclaimed their oceans, and on Sarix, the Krill emerged from underground to retake their cities, and on Hestrix 7, the Lumens turned their frozen moon into a graveyard for Vrexian ships, and everywhere the pattern repeated as conquered species rose up together. The empire that had stood for 3 centuries crumbled in 3 weeks because it was built on fear and superior coordination. And when Jacob destroyed their ability to coordinate and showed the galaxy they could be beaten, then fear changed sides, and the Vrexians became the ones who were afraid. On Vrexia Prime, war leader Draxel led a strike force into the ruins of the communications nexus, searching for Jacob's body, but he found only destruction and no human remains, and his second-in-command said Jacob could not have survived such an explosion. But Draxel knew better because he had hunted Jacob long enough to understand the human was hard to kill, and he looked up at the sky where ships from liberated worlds were converging on Vrexia Prime, and he said it did not matter if Jacob was dead or alive because he had already won and the Empire was finished. 3 months later, Maya stood in the rebuilt United Earth headquarters, which now served as the meeting place for the Galactic Liberation Council, and representatives from hundreds of formerly conquered worlds gathered to discuss the future and build something better than an empire. She received a message on an encrypted channel that only one person knew existed, and it said the war was over, and the people were free, and Jacob part was done, and he was going somewhere quiet to rest because he had earned it, and Maya should take care of the galaxy because everyone had fought too hard to let it fall again. Maya smiled and saved the message in her private files, and decided to let the galaxy think Jacob Hayes had died destroying the Vrexian Communications Center, because sometimes legends were more powerful than truth, and the legend of the human who stood against an empire would inspire people for generations. Out in the Outer Rim, on a small farming colony that used to be a Vrexian prison world, a man who looked tired and scarred tended a garden, and his neighbors knew him only as Jake, and he was quiet and kept to himself, but sometimes helped fix broken equipment because he was good with technology. At night he looked up at the stars and remembered the battles and the people who died and the moment when he stood alone at the heart of an empire. But mostly, he just enjoyed the peace and the simple fact that he had survived, and the galaxy was free. They had conquered 1,000 worlds, but one human had stood in their way, and in the end he brought their empire to its knees, not through superior weapons or technology, but through knowledge and determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. And that was the most human thing of all. The effect of Jacob's message was like throwing a match into a room full of explosives, because suddenly the entire galaxy was on fire with rebellions, and the Vrexian Empire that had conquered 1,000 worlds over 300 years found itself fighting on every front at once, and their military was strong, but it was not strong enough to fight everywhere simultaneously. On Earth, the Vrexian occupation forces were cut off from reinforcements because their high command was too busy dealing with uprisings on other planets, and the human resistance that now numbered in the millions pressed their advantage and attacked Vrexian bases and supply lines and slowly took back their world one city at a time. Maya Price coordinated the global resistance from a captured Vrexian command ship that Jacob team had seized during the orbital station raid, and she worked 20 hours a day organizing attacks and moving supplies, and making sure that every victory the humans won got broadcast across the galaxy, so other species could see that the Empire could be beaten. Helen Grant worked with scientists from dozens of other species, sharing information from the data crystals, and teaching everyone the Vrexian weaknesses and how to exploit them. and slowly a network formed, connecting all the rebellions and sharing tactics and technology and support. But Jacob himself had disappeared after the orbital assault, and only Maya knew where he had gone because he had told her his plan before he left, and she thought he was crazy, but she also knew that crazy plans were the only kind that worked against the Vrexians. Jacob was traveling between the conquered worlds on a stolen Vrexian stealth ship, and he moved from system to system like a ghost meeting with resistance leaders and teaching them everything he had learned about fighting the Empire, and each world he visited became stronger and more dangerous to the Vrexians. On a water world called Aqualis, he taught the native Sithari how to use their swimming abilities to sabotage underwater mining operations, and the Vrexians had never developed defenses against aquatic fighters, because no species had ever dared to resist from the oceans before, and suddenly their most profitable mining operations were under constant attack. On a desert planet named Syrinx, he showed the insect people called the Krill how to use their natural tunneling abilities to create supply networks under the surface, where Vrexian sensors could not detect them, and the aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that could appear anywhere through the ground itself. On a frozen moon called Hestrix 7, he worked with crystalline beings called lumens who could manipulate electromagnetic fields, and he taught them how to weaponize this ability to blind Vrexian sensors and disrupt their communications, and suddenly, the Empire forces on that world were fighting blind and deaf. Each world he visited and each species he trained added another crack to the Empire foundation, and Jacob was not just fighting a war anymore, but building a network of rebellions that supported each other and learned from each other and grew stronger together. But the Vrexians were not stupid, and they recognized that Jacob was the key to everything, and if they could kill him, the rebellions might fall apart without their teacher and inspiration. And so the High Command designated him as enemy number 1 and offered a massive reward for his capture or death. They assembled a special task force led by a war leader named Draxel, who was the most feared commander in the Vrexian military, and he had crushed 40 rebellions and conquered 60 worlds personally, and the High Command gave him unlimited resources, and one mission which was to find Jacob Hayes and kill him. Draxel was different from other Vrexian commanders because he did not underestimate his enemies, and he studied Jacob movements and tactics and looked for patterns, and he understood that Jacob was the most dangerous individual in the entire galaxy. Because one person with knowledge and determination could inspire millions. Their first confrontation happened on a mining world called Keltros 9, where Jacob was training a resistance cell and Draxel fleet dropped out of hyperspace and trapped him on the planet, and the Vrexian commander broadcast a message saying he knew Jacob was there, and his forces had surrounded the world, and Jacob could either face him directly, or Draxel would destroy every city until he found him. Jacob knew Draxel meant what he said because the Vrexian commander had a reputation for ruthlessness that made other Vrexian leaders look kind by comparison, and he could not let innocent people die, so he transmitted a response telling Draxel that if he wanted him, then he should come and get him. What followed was a week-long chase across the mining world, and Draxel commanded thousands of soldiers and dozens of warships. But Jacob had himself and a few local fighters, and his knowledge of Vrexian tactics, and he turned the entire planet into a weapon. He triggered industrial accidents that looked natural, and led patrols into ambushes and used his engineering knowledge to collapse tunnels and destroy bridges and make the Vrexians afraid to move anywhere without checking for traps first. On the 7th day, Jacob managed to sneak onto Draxel command ship itself and planted explosives throughout the vessel, and left a message for the Vrexian commander saying that Draxel was not hunting him, but rather Jacob was teaching the Vrexians what it meant to be afraid. Draxel barely escaped before his flagship exploded, and the loss humiliated him in front of the High Command, but it also earned him a strange kind of respect for the human warrior because no one had ever gotten that close to killing him before. The High Overlord of the Vrexian Empire watched reports of the incident and began to think differently about Jacob Hayes, because this human fought like no other species they had encountered, and maybe they had been approaching the problem wrong, and maybe instead of trying to kill Jacob they should try to recruit him. The Overlord issued an order that shocked the entire empire, and he sent a message to Jacob offering him a position in the Vrexian military with command of his own fleet and advanced technology, and the promise that Earth would be spared from further destruction if Jacob would stop the rebellions and serve the Empire. The message reached Jacob while he was recovering from wounds on a rebel base in the Outer Rim, and Maya transmitted it from Earth with disbelief in her voice, because the Vrexians were offering him everything, including power and resources and the safety of his homeworld, and all he had to do was betray every other species fighting for freedom. Jacob read the offer in silence and thought about his daughter Sophie, and all the humans who had died fighting the Vrexians and all the other species across the galaxy who were finally standing up against their oppressors, and he thought about what it would mean to accept this offer and have everything he needed to protect Earth. He sent his response in 2 words, which were "humanity declines," and then he deleted the message and went back to planning his next operation. The Vrexian High Command received his response, and the Overlord realized they could not buy Jacob Hayes, and they could not break him, and so they decided to make an example of his entire species, and they assembled the largest invasion fleet in centuries and set course for Earth with 3 million soldiers and 5,000 warships. The message was clear to everyone who saw it, and that message was that if they could not recruit the human who started the rebellions, then they would destroy his whole planet and show the galaxy what happened to species who dared to resist the Empire. Maya received intelligence reports about the fleet and contacted Jacob immediately, telling him they were coming, and Earth could not survive another invasion with their forces depleted from months of fighting. And Jacob looked at the star charts and calculated that the fleet would reach Earth in 3 weeks. He told Maya they had 3 weeks to end everything, and she asked what he meant, and he said he was not going to end the war, but rather he was going to end the Empire itself, and it was time to cut off the head of the snake, and he was going to Vrexia Prime, which was the Vrexian homeworld. 6 months into what the Vrexians thought would be an easy occupation, and things were going badly for them, because Earth was still fighting, and the resistance was getting stronger instead of weaker. And this had never happened before in all the hundreds of worlds they had conquered, and their commanders were confused and angry, and starting to doubt whether they could actually hold this planet. Jacob Hayes had become a legend that scared Vrexian soldiers so much that some of them refused to go on patrol at night, because they thought the ghost might get them, and their officers tried to tell them that Jacob was just one man, and one man could not defeat an empire. But the soldiers had seen what one man could do when he knew all your secrets and was not afraid to die fighting. In a hidden base under the Australian desert, Jacob met with leaders from resistance cells around the world, and they gathered around a table covered with maps and stolen Vrexian equipment, and they all looked tired because they had been fighting for half a year without rest. But they also looked determined because they knew they were winning slowly, and that was better than losing quickly. Jacob told them what he had learned from the data crystals about how the Vrexian Empire was organized, and he explained that the Empire was not as united as it seemed, and the conquered worlds were kept separate and controlled through fear, and the Vrexians had never tried to actually integrate the species they defeated, because that would be too much work and require too much trust. Maya pulled up a star chart on the holographic display and showed everyone how the Vrexian communication network worked, and she said that every time they attacked on Earth, there were ripples throughout the Empire, and other conquered worlds were watching, and some of them were starting to ask themselves why they were still slaves when humans were proving that the Vrexians could be beaten. Helen Grant explained that she had decoded more of the data crystals and found a critical weakness in how the Vrexian military was organized, because every decision had to be approved by their high command on their homeworld, and this made them powerful but also slow to adapt. And if humans could cut off communications between Earth and the Vrexian homeworld, then the alien forces here would be isolated and unable to get new orders or reinforcements. Jacob studied the maps and thought about everything they had learned, and he realized that the Vrexians had defeated Earth so quickly at the start because they had surprise on their side, but humans had been fighting for 6 months now and were still here, and that was something none of the other conquered species had managed to do, and this meant something important about human stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat. Kyle Martinez, who was now a sergeant, told them that scouts had reported the Vrexians were pulling some forces away from Earth and sending them to other parts of their empire, and this meant the aliens were having problems elsewhere, and every day that Earth resisted it inspired other worlds to resist too, and the whole empire was starting to crack under the pressure. Jacob pointed to a spot on the map that showed a Vrexian command station in orbit above Earth, and he said they were going to capture it and use the communications equipment to broadcast a message to every conquered world in the Empire and tell them all that humans had found a way to fight back and win, And this would start a fire that would burn across the entire galaxy. Everyone in the room got quiet because they knew the orbital station was the most heavily defended place in the solar system, and attacking it was basically suicide. But Jacob said he had been studying the defense patterns for months, and the Vrexians were overconfident and thought humans were just insects that could not really hurt them, and they would never expect a direct assault on their command center. He told them he was not ordering anyone to come with him, and this was a volunteer mission, and anyone who came needed to understand they probably would not survive, but if they succeeded, they would free not just Earth, but potentially hundreds of other worlds, and 50 people stepped forward immediately because they had all lost someone to the Vrexians, and they wanted revenge more than they wanted to live. Helen gave Jacob a small device that contained a virus she had designed using Vrexian code against itself, and if he could plug it into the station computer, it would give them control of the communications array, and also lower the shields for exactly 10 minutes, and Jacob said 10 minutes was all they would need to finish what they came to do. The assault team launched before dawn using captured Vrexian shuttles that Helen had modified to look like regular supply ships, and they flew in formation following the flight patterns that Jacob had memorized from the data crystals and the Vrexian. Defenses did not notice anything wrong until the shuttles suddenly changed course and headed straight for the docking bays, instead of the cargo area. The battle for the station was fast and brutal, and the assault team fought through corridors that were built for creatures twice their size, and they used the Vrexians' own overconfidence against them because the aliens had never imagined that humans would dare attack their command center, and so their internal security was not as strong as it should have been. Kyle Martinez died holding a corridor so the rest of the team could advance, and he killed 15 Vrexians before they finally brought him down, and other volunteers fell one by one, protecting the mission and buying time with their lives so that Jacob could reach the central control room where the main computer was located. The station commander was a huge Vrexian named Korthel, who stood between Jacob and the computer, and he had 4 arms and each one held a weapon, and he told Jacob that he was honored to kill the ghost personally and end the human resistance once and for all. Jacob raised his rifle and said the Vrexian had it backwards because the resistance was not ending today, and it was only just getting started, and then they fought. And it was savage and desperate, and Jacob used everything he had learned about Vrexian combat techniques from the data crystals and from fighting them for 6 months. Korthel was stronger, but Jacob was faster, and more importantly, Jacob was fighting for something while Korthel was just following orders, and that made all the difference in the end. And when the Vrexian commander fell, Jacob staggered to the computer and plugged in Helen's device with hands that were shaking from exhaustion and pain. Maya's voice came through his radio saying they had control of the system, and they were broadcasting now. And Jacob recorded his message to the galaxy saying that he was Commander Jacob Hayes of Earth, and for 300 years, the Vrexians had told everyone that resistance was futile, but humans were still fighting and still winning, and they had learned all the Vrexian secrets and proven that the Empire could be defeated. He told every enslaved species and every conquered world that Earth stood with them, and they should rise up and fight back because the Empire was going to fall today, and his message went out across the Vrexian communication network, reaching hundreds of worlds and billions of beings who had lived under alien rule for generations. As the message played on repeat, Maya activated the second part of the plan, and every military force that Earth still had struck at Vrexian installations simultaneously, and it was coordinated perfectly because they had been planning this for months in secret, and the Vrexians who thought they had crushed human resistance suddenly found themselves fighting on every continent at once. The message reached other conquered worlds, and within days, uprisings started on 17 planets, and within weeks that number grew to over 100, and the Vrexian Empire that had seemed unstoppable for 3 centuries suddenly found itself fighting wars everywhere, and their forces were stretched too thin and their commanders were panicking. Jacob barely made it off the station alive, and he was wounded badly, but he had succeeded in doing what everyone said was impossible, and he had turned one planet resistance into a galaxy-wide rebellion, and now the real war was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the Vrexians invaded Earth, and now the planet was split between the aliens who controlled the big cities and the humans who hid in the mountains and deserts and forests and fought back whenever they could, and the United Earth military was broken into small groups that worked alone because meeting in large numbers just made them easy targets for the Vrexian ships that patrolled the skies looking for anyone who dared to resist. Jacob Hayes had become something different than a normal soldier, because he was not following orders anymore, and he was not part of any unit, and instead he moved alone from place to place, striking at the Vrexians whenever he found a weakness, and then disappearing before they could catch him, and the aliens were starting to call him the Ghost because nobody could see him coming, and nobody could track where he went after he attacked. He had left the bunker 6 weeks earlier because he knew that commanding from a hidden base was not going to win this war, and the only way to hurt the Vrexians was to study them up close and learn their patterns and hit them in ways they never expected, and so he took the knowledge from the data crystals and went out into the occupied territories alone, with just his weapons and his determination to make the aliens pay for what they had done to his world. His second target was a fuel depot near what used to be Atlanta, and the Vrexians needed a special type of fuel for their ships and weapons, and they had to bring it from other planets because Earth did not have it naturally, and Jacob watched the depot for 3 days, learning when the supply ships came and when the guards changed shifts, and where they stored the fuel tanks, and on the 4th day he snuck in during a dust storm that made it hard for the Vrexian sensors to see clearly. The explosion when he blew up the fuel depot was so big that it lit up the sky for 50 miles and destroyed enough fuel to ground the entire Vrexian fleet in North America for weeks, and this meant the aliens could not send their ships to attack resistance groups or bomb human shelters, and it gave the resistance time to grow stronger and gather more weapons and recruit more fighters who were angry about what had happened to their families and their homes. Maya Price stayed in contact with Jacob through encrypted radio messages, and she told him that the Vrexians were going crazy trying to find him, and they had pulled soldiers from South America and Asia to search for one man, and Jacob said that was exactly what he wanted because every soldier looking for him was a soldier not hurting civilians and not crushing resistance cells, and this was all part of his plan to stretch the Vrexian forces thin until they made mistakes. The Vrexians increased their security everywhere and changed their patrol routes and added more guards to their bases, but Jacob was always one step ahead because he had memorized everything from the data crystals, and he knew how the Vrexians thought and how they would respond to threats, and he used this knowledge to predict their moves before they made them. And he was always in the last place they expected him to be. He hit a weapons factory in Beijing next and stole enough plasma rifles to arm 50 resistance fighters, and then he destroyed the factory so the Vrexians could not make more weapons there, and on his way out he left a message written in Vrexian, symbols that said humans do not forget and humans do not forgive. And this message scared the aliens more than any bomb could, because it meant that humans were learning to speak their language and understand their culture, and that made them less like animals and more like a real threat. Stories about Jacob spread through both the human resistance and the Vrexian forces, and people started calling him different names, and some said he was 10 feet tall and could kill a Vrexian with his bare hands, and some said he could turn invisible and walk through walls, and none of these stories were true, but Jacob did not mind because fear was a weapon just like guns and bombs, and if the stories made the Vrexians scared, then that was fine with him. Kyle Martinez, who had found the data crystals, was now training other soldiers in hit-and-run tactics and teaching them everything Jacob had learned about fighting the Vrexians. And Helen Grant was working on ways to turn the alien technology against them, and Maya Price was coordinating attacks all over the planet and making sure that when Jacob hit a target, the resistance groups would hit other targets at the same time to multiply the chaos and confusion. But the Vrexians were learning too, and they sent their best hunters after Jacob, and one of them was a commander named Thexlar, who was smarter than the other aliens and more patient, and he studied every attack Jacob made and looked for patterns in the timing and the targets, and after 6 weeks of studying, he finally figured out where Jacob would strike next. Jacob was leaving a Vrexian communications hub in the ruins of Beijing when he realized he was surrounded, and Vrexian soldiers came out of buildings on all sides with their weapons pointed at him, and Thexlar stepped forward from behind his troops and spoke through his translator, telling Jacob that his fighting was over, and he should surrender now and accept a quick death instead of being tortured for information. Jacob checked his ammunition and saw he had 3 magazines left, and there were 40 Vrexian soldiers surrounding him, and the math was simple and the odds were impossible, but he smiled anyway because he knew something the Vrexians did not know, and that was that humans have a special kind of crazy that makes them dangerous even when they should be dead. He told Thexlar that the Vrexians had conquered 1,000 worlds, but they had never fought anyone stupid enough to fight back alone, and they could not predict what humans would do because humans do not quit, even when quitting makes sense. And then he opened fire and ran toward the nearest building, and the battle that followed would be talked about for years afterward by both sides. Jacob used every trick he had learned and every weakness he had discovered and every advantage the ruined city gave him. And he led the Vrexians through collapsed buildings and flooded tunnels and up broken stairways that could barely hold his weight and definitely could not hold their heavier bodies, and he picked them off one by one, using their own tactics against them and making them afraid to go around corners because they did not know if he was waiting there. The fight lasted all night, and when the sun came up, Thexlar was dead along with 30 of his soldiers, and the rest had run away because they were too scared to keep fighting. And Jacob was hurt badly with wounds that would have killed most people, but he kept moving because he had to, and too many people were counting on him to give up now. He made it to a safe house that the resistance maintained, and a doctor patched him up and gave him medicine for the pain, and told him he needed to rest for at least a week. But Jacob said he did not have a week because the war was still going on and people were still dying, and he had more targets to hit before the Vrexians figured out how to stop him. Maya sent him a message saying that the Vrexians were changing their tactics and pulling back from some areas and reinforcing others. And Jacob said good, because that meant they were scared, and when your enemy is scared they make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities, and opportunities were what the resistance needed most right now. He spent 2 days planning his next operation and studying the new Vrexian deployment patterns and looking for the weaknesses in their updated security protocols, and he found several places where they had made errors in their planning because they were so focused on finding him that they forgot to protect other important targets, and this was exactly the kind of mistake he had been waiting for them to make. The Vrexian Empire had been conquering worlds for 300 years, and nobody could stop them because they were too strong and too smart and too ruthless in everything they did, and now they had their eyes set on Earth as their next target, and the humans had no idea what was coming for them until it was almost too late to do anything about it. And the invasion began on a Tuesday morning, when the skies across the planet suddenly filled with massive alien ships that blocked out the sun and started firing weapons that turned cities into burning ruins within minutes, and millions of people died before anyone even understood what was happening to them and their world. Jacob Hayes was a commander in the United Earth military, and he was sitting in a bunker deep under the mountains when the reports started coming in from every corner of the planet, and each report was worse than the one before it. And he watched on the screens as Tokyo burned and Moscow fell, and the fleets humanity had sent to stop the aliens got destroyed, like they were made of paper and not metal. And all he could think about was his daughter Sophie, who was somewhere in a shelter, and he hoped she was safe, but he had no way to know for sure because the communication networks were failing everywhere. The Vrexians sent a message to the bunker, and a huge alien appeared on the screen with 4 arms and armor that looked like it could stop anything, and it spoke through a translator in a voice that sounded like thunder and rocks grinding together. And it told the humans that resistance was pointless because they had conquered species far more advanced than humanity, and Earth should surrender now or be turned into ash and dust. And everyone in the bunker looked at Jacob and waited to see what he would say back to this creature that had destroyed half their planet in a single day. Jacob stood up and walked closer to the screen and looked at the alien commander and said that humans do not surrender, and they never will. And then he cut off the transmission before the alien could respond, and within seconds the bombardment of their position got much worse and the bunker shook like an earthquake was tearing it apart. But Jacob did not care, because he knew that showing fear was the same as losing, and he would not give these aliens that satisfaction, even if it meant dying right here and right now. The battle for Earth continued for days and then weeks, and the Vrexians were winning everywhere they fought, because they had better weapons and better ships and better everything. But the humans kept fighting anyway, because that is what humans do when someone tries to take their home away from them, and they die fighting rather than live as slaves. And this surprised the Vrexians, who had expected an easy victory like all the other worlds they had conquered before. During a fight in the ruins of Chicago, a Vrexian supply ship got shot down by human missiles, and it crashed into an old building and exploded and sent debris everywhere. And when human soldiers went to search the wreckage, they found something strange among all the broken metal and burning fuel, and it was a set of crystalline devices that glowed with an inner light and pulsed like they were alive. And a soldier named Kyle Martinez picked them up and brought them back to base because he thought they might be important, even though he had no idea what they actually were. The scientists at the base looked at the crystals and got very excited because they realized these were Vrexian data storage devices, and they contained information that could help humanity fight back. But first they had to break the encryption that protected the data inside, and a doctor named Helen Grant worked on the problem for 3 days without sleeping, until finally she cracked the code and saw what was stored inside the crystals. What Helen found made her hands shake as she read through file after file, because the crystals contained the complete military records of the Vrexian Empire going back hundreds of years, and it showed every species they had conquered, and every battle they had fought, and every tactic they had used, and most importantly it showed their weaknesses, and the places where they were vulnerable and could be hurt if someone knew exactly where to strike them. She brought the information to Jacob immediately, and he spent the next week reading through everything and memorizing patterns and studying how the Vrexians fought, and how they thought, and how they organized their military. And the more he read, the more he understood that the Vrexians were powerful, but they were not invincible, and they made the same mistakes over and over again because they had been winning for so long that they had gotten lazy and predictable. Jacob realized that Earth could not win a normal war against the Vrexians because they had too many ships and too many soldiers and too many resources spread across 1,000 conquered worlds, but one person who knew all their secrets and all their weaknesses could do damage that whole armies could not do, and he could hit them where they did not expect it and make them afraid in a way they had never been afraid before. He gathered his officers and told them his plan, and they said he was crazy because what he wanted to do was impossible and would probably get him killed. But Jacob said that dying while fighting was better than living under alien rule. And besides, the Vrexians did not know what humans were capable of when they got pushed too far, and had nothing left to lose but their pride. Lieutenant Maya Price was the only one who understood what Jacob was trying to do, and she said she would help coordinate his missions from the bunker and keep him connected to the other resistance groups that were forming around the planet, and Jacob thanked her, and then he left the bunker that same night with just a small pack of supplies and weapons and all the knowledge from the Vrexian data crystals stored in his head. His first target was a Vrexian command post in what used to be Denver, and he walked right in through the front door using stolen alien technology to make their sensors think he was one of them, and the Vrexians never suspected a thing because they thought all humans were either dead or hiding in caves, and they certainly did not expect one to just walk into their base like he owned the place, and Jacob planted explosives on their communications equipment and was gone before anyone noticed him. When the bombs went off, they destroyed the entire communications network for the region and cut off thousands of Vrexian soldiers from their commanders, and this caused chaos and confusion and made it much harder for them to coordinate their attacks and control the territory they had taken, and the human resistance groups in the area used this opportunity to strike back at small Vrexian patrols and supply convoys, and suddenly the aliens found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see or predict. Jacob watched the explosion from 5 miles away and smiled because he knew this was just the beginning, and he had hundreds of targets marked in his mind, and he would hit every single one of them until the Vrexians learned to fear the dark and the shadows where humans could hide and strike without warning. And maybe then they would understand that Earth was not like the other worlds they had conquered, and humans were not like the other species they had enslaved.